I have to thank the Department of English, Sudhiranjan Lahiri Mahavidyalaya, for organizing this online lecture series under the leadership of the head of the department, Shilpi Boshak. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share certain of my observations about romantic literature. The issues and perspectives are to be dealt with in this lecture. Now, first of all, the thing that I should make clear is the fact that this is to be an informal discussion about various facets of romantic literature and romanticism that the undergraduate students will do well to understand and make clear. So the thing is, feel free to ask questions, feel free to clarify with me any doubt that you may possess. Obviously, it is impossible for anyone to discuss all the facets of romanticism, romantic movement, romantic literature in one lecture. And Shilpi Boshak has also requested me to situate the selected texts of the Kalyani University undergraduate syllabus, English syllabus, so as to make sense of this particular vast area to the batch of undergraduate students who are here with us. So I will try an impossibility. I am not sure how far I will succeed. But one thing has to be made clear at the outset. It is the fact that in order to make any sense of romantic literature, in order to make any sense of the romantic period, and in order to make any sense of the selected texts in terms of the period of romantic period, you have to understand both the background and the foreground. So let us go to the second slide of my presentation. First we have to deal with the definitions and the indefinitions. What is the problem of providing a definition of so vast an area, so vast a movement, and so vast a phenomenon as romantic literature? The fact is, my dear friends, no one definition put forward by expert after expert has till now adequately summed up all the facets of the literature of this period. That is why we have to think about definitions and indefinitions, because the thing is at once definite and indefinite. It is easier to know or see, when you see a dog, it is easier to know the dog than to define the dog. Because romantic literature, romanticism, and the romantic movement, these have to be understood in terms of and against other things. For example, there are things like neoclassicism, the Enlightenment thought, rationalism, and such other mouthfuls that we have to distinguish romanticism from. So in order to do that, let us tackle romanticism and romantic literature. it is easier for me to come to the definition from a discussion. And that is precisely what I would try to do. So let us think about romanticism. Look at it. The word contains romantic plus ism. Then romance, then ik plus ism. So, in order to make sense of what romanticism is, we can very easily say, in a very naive and simplistic way, that romanticism means a movement in literature and the other arts that placed more emphasis on imagination, emotion, and the individual, in contradistinction to what had gone before, that is neoclassicism, wherein the emphasis was laid on reason, on facts. Obviously, romanticism is an expansive individualistic movement that affected the realms of art, that affected the realms of music, architecture, the fine arts, literature, and so on and so forth. So the word romanticism comes from the word romantic. We often talk about a romantic number, a romantic song. And obviously, the thing that comes to our mind first is a love interest. Boy meets girl, there is song and dance, they fall in love, get married, and live happily ever after. That is the very significant but simplistic idea of what romantic means based on our Valentine Day experience or Saraswati Puja experience. But you know, romantic as a signifier has got other things up its sleeve. The question of adventure, the question of imagination, the question of emotion, the question of the long ago and the far away, the question of a movement back to nature, all these things need to be discussed in order to make sense of the romantic movement and romantic literature. Because romance, the word etymologically derives from the Roman languages and the literature characteristic of those languages, wherein adventure, love, imagination, all these things played very significant parts. So how do we come from romance to romantic and then from romantic to romanticism? In order to make sense of this, I will try to tell you about a definition of what is ism. We often come across such terms as Marxism, modernism, Victorianism, romanticism, classicism, Hinduism, and so on and so forth. Then what is an ism? We all know that this is basically a noun suffix that constructs a noun. For example, romanticism is a noun. We all know that. What does it mean? Now, in order to make sense of this, to my own students, I had long ago devised a working layman's definition of ism. And I am going to tell you that any ism at the bottom means a system of arguments, that believes in and or propagates the existence of something, the desirability of something, or the dominance of something. Inversely, it can also mean the existence of someone's opinions, the desirability of someone's opinions, or the dominance of someone's opinions. Okay, let us use this definition of this excuse me, of this definition of an ism. Let us use this in order to define and make sense of romance. We know in the word romantic there is romance and or romant, and then there is ik, an adjectival suffix that means of or pertaining to. So romantic means of or pertaining to characteristic of romance. So what is romanticism? It is the system of arguments. It is a perspective that believes in and or propagates what? The existence of romance, the desirability of romance, and the dominance of romance. So obviously, if the literature or art of a particular period displays the existence, the desirability, or the dominance of romance and romantic qualities, then obviously it will be called romanticism. Similarly, when we talk about Marxism, for example, what is Marxism? It is a system of arguments based on the works of Karl Marx that believes in or propagates the existence of Marx's opinions, the desirability of Marx's opinions, and the dominance of Marx. So this is what I mean by the word romanticism. We all know that when we are talking as students of literature, when we are talking about romanticism, when we are talking about the romantic period, when we are talking about romantic literature, we are actually trying to talk about the literature of a period that spanned from the latter half, from the last decades of the 18th century and continued up to the, say, arguably, the first 3 decades of the 19th century. So from 1780 or thereabouts to 1830 or thereabouts. This was according to the historians of literature. This is considered to be the romantic period, and obviously the literature produced in this period is often called romantic literature. But here we have to stand still and take stock of what we have understood. My dear friends, the literature of the romantic period, if we really want to understand it, was a revival, and that's why often this question comes: why is the romantic period called romantic revival? Why is it called romantic revolt? It was a revival of something. Revival means bringing back something. or resuscitating something. So obviously, if we are bringing back something, that means it existed beforehand as well. So romantic revival means that this romantic period or something akin to this romantic period existed beforehand. And we can say, if we read our history of literature properly, if we read our literature properly, that means English literature properly, we will understand that we are reviving the literary conventions, the styles and genres of a bygone era, the Elizabethan age. So that was the original romantic age in English literature, from the perspective of English literary discussion. So that is why it is called revival. Similarly, it is called revolt. Now, I have a son who studies in class 12. Poor chap, he is being bullied by the coronavirus, and that's why he is in a very bad way now. Now, he often thinks that I am stupid. I become mad. But then if we think about it, I also thought about my father the same way. My father also thought about his father the same way. And my son's child, if he or she comes to this world, will think about my son in the same way. This is called the generation gap. It is often characterized by a revolt, the inability or the unwillingness, reluctance to toe the line of our fathers. That is called the generation gap. Now, the romantic literatures, the men of letters, the artists, they revolted against the conventions of their fathers, the neoclassical fathers. For whom? For these neoclassicists, everything was based on rules and pre-existing models. The models of Greeks and Romans, the model of venerated antiquity. This was their way of looking at things. But the Romantics wanted to revolt against what had gone just before. That is why it is called the Romantic Revolt. And if you read a poem like, say, Rape of the Lock, and a poem like, say, the Lucy poems by Wordsworth, or the Solitary Reaper by Wordsworth, you will see that there is a basic difference, not only in the theme, but also in the treatment of those themes. So that is why it is called a revolt. But here I would like to request you to think about something from a fresher perspective. What am I talking about? I am talking about the continuations of the Romantic period and Romantic literature. It was not that all things were rejected summarily. Certain things were continued. Certain things were continued by certain persons. For example, in the poetry of George Byron, the spirit of satire lurks just beneath the surface. So obviously, not all things, not all works of literature produced in the Romantic period could be called romantic. And no two writers may show their adherence to the romantic ideal in the same way. So not all of them were romantics, and not all of them were romantics in the same way. They were romantics in their different ways. That is why a George Gordon Lord Byron as a romantic poet is different from a Wordsworth as a romantic poet. And that is why we have to understand Arthur O. Lovejoy has come up with the concept of romanticisms. Rather than one single romanticism, he talks about romanticisms, different kinds of romanticism, different shades of romanticism. Because different writers, different thinkers, different artists were romantic in their unique, different ways. Are you getting my point? Because romanticism, romantic movement, romantic literature can be defined and explained in terms of rejection of certain values, certain conventions, and at the same time, promotion of certain other things. Let's go to the next slide, please. Slide number 3. You see, we have to think about contexts, prasanga, and concepts, tattva. I have already told you, my dear friends, that romanticism operated, influenced on, romanticism operated on or influenced or worked on certain writers in certain ways, different writers in different ways. So obviously, romantic literature is not homogeneous. What we understand by romantic literature is not all uniform or of the same kind. Wordsworth is different as a romantic poet than Shelley. Shelley is different as a romantic poet than your Keats. They are all different from Coleridge as romantic poets. Byron is different from them as romantic poets. Frankenstein is a text that you are supposed to study. Now, Mary Shelley as a writer was different from Jane Austen. So their attitude towards romanticism, their response to romanticism was different. And this is what you, my dear friends, have to understand. That is why we are talking about contexts and concepts. What are there? We see there are in this slide certain points. What are there? One of you read it out. Okay. So you see commerce and control. You see, you all know the name of such individuals as Columbus, Amerigo Vespucci, Vasco da Gama, Captain Smith, Walter Raleigh. You all know about them. They had gone out from European countries and discovered certain new places, new to them, because they didn't know about those places. Okay? Sea exploration during the Renaissance. You all have read about it. See, This meant that when they went to those places, found untapped resources, they wanted to utilize those resources. They wanted to exploit those resources. That's why they started trade and commerce with these new places, the new world. In The Tempest, you have read about the brave new world, about which Huxley had later written a novel. So, in a different context, obviously. So, a brave new world was being discovered. And for the old world of Europe, there was Eurocentrism. During the Renaissance, Europe was put at the center. And, along with commerce, there was the onset of greed, the greed for control. Because there was untold riches and resources in the New World. And the Europeans wanted to control the English, the French, the Spaniards. They wanted to control and exploit those resources. Okay. How could they engage in trade with these people from the New World? How could they control and exploit the resources of the New World? They wanted to settle down, establish colonies. And from this, obviously, these Europeans harbored the idea of establishing, founding empires. At the center, there will be the mother country, and there will be other countries, the colonies, and the entire system will fall into place as an empire. Okay. So this angle was also there. Yes. Yes. Am I audible? Am I making sense? তোমরা বুঝতে পারছো তো?
হ্যাঁ স্যার বুঝতে পারছি।
Okay. So from this came another aspect of the European history, that is called the Enlightenment. Enlightenment meant rhyme and reason. So rationality became the name of the game. And that is why in the neoclassical period, say from 1660 to the 1780s, the spirit of satire, the spirit of urbane wit, ratiocination, all these things ruled the roost. Imagination, emotion, and the individual, they were pushed to the background. Okay? Then another thing came to rule the socio-economic sphere, that was the slavery. You know that people from Africa were brought to Europe and America to work as slaves, and their labor fattened the purses of these countries and their population. As a result, what happened? As a result, a gross injustice was perpetrated, cruelty was perpetrated by man against other men. But man is a rational entity. At the same time, man has emotions and feelings. So such a period of iniquity could not go on. So obviously, other contradictory spirits were coming to the fore. Earlier, agriculture was everything. Now industry became important as well. There was a fast wave of industrial revolution. As a result, certain very important changes were occurring. There was a spurt in the urbanization drive. Towns and cities vied with villages and the countryside. As a result, communities were disturbed. New communities were created. As a result, disturbances became very, very common and formidable. Okay? Then, if you read a work like, what is that there? Yes, say Gulliver's Travels, you will see that political, religious, cultural feuds became very, very important and rife. But again, such a period could not go on forever. Time was bound to change. And the authority of the European system, the long-standing, worm-eaten, decrepit system, was signaled by certain very important political events. There was the American War of Independence. From the British Empire, the American colonialists wanted to secede. They wanted to break away from this empire. Then, both England and France became embroiled in this conflict because the colonial master was the England of the day. And France had its own colonialist agenda. France got involved in this American War of Independence. And in so doing, further depleted the resources of its hard-hit economy, of its coffers. This led inversely, indirectly, to another revolution, the French Revolution of 1789. The motto of which was liberty, equality, fraternity. So the spirit was changing. Understood? The spirit was changing. And here you have to understand that enlightenment had its proponent in Voltaire. Similarly, Romanticism had its proponent in Rousseau. So if on the one hand, Enlightenment and Romanticism both set great stores by the rights of the individual, they differed in the ways they wanted to bring about the emancipation of humanity. Okay. Then we have also heard about and discussed neoclassicism. So if Enlightenment and rationalism became the target for the Romantics to break away from, then neoclassicism also became another target in the art world for the Romantics to break away from. Then we have to talk about other things. Idealism, which believes in the primacy of the idea and the ideal. The idea of the thing is more important for a Kant, for a Hegel, for a Fichte, or for a Schelling. And the Romantics were greatly influenced by these German figures. Unfortunately, because of a lack of time, I am not going to, or I am not being able to discuss these things in detail. It's unfortunate. Coming back, there were other things. For example, there was empiricism, which believed that all things could be understood in terms of or through the senses, through experience, which was empirical. Then Romanticism also had interaction with other things such as mysticism. It is an expansion of perception. Communion with the Godhead or with the motive force of the world. The expansion of perception of the infinite, the sublime, and also an understanding of the mystery of the place of the individual in face of that infinite. I am sure that I am dropping words and concepts right, left, and center without explaining them adequately. But my dear friends, please keep these words and concepts in mind, and one day, in not too distant a future, you will understand this in greater detail. Please remember these words if you don't remember their meanings at least. Similarly, there was something called individualism that placed the individual at the center of everything. The individual at the center of everything. Government, rules, conventions, society in its collective form, all these things became loathsome to the individual. The self and its subjectivity, personality, these things were placed at the center. আমার চেতনার রঙে পান্না হলো সবুজ. I at the center of everything. The human consciousness, which is subjective. চুনি উঠলো রাঙা হয়ে, আমি চোখ মেললাম জ্বলে উঠলো আলো. Why? Because until and unless you open your eyes, how do you know that there is light or not? গোলাপের দিকে তাকিয়ে বললাম সুন্দর, সুন্দর হলো সে. So it is I at the center, the individual at the center, that gives meaning, that gives value, that gives urgency to the world outside. Okay. Have I left out anything from this slide? I have discussed that. Slavery I have discussed. Yes. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, there are certain discussion topics, things to be discussed. You know, I know that there are certain topics for discussion, subjects for discussion on your syllabus. You know, along with the textual component, there are certain topics. I have read those topics, thought about them, but I have come up with my own list based on my priorities and my understanding of romantic literature. So let us talk about them, go one by one. So first thing you have to understand, that is the events and movements that I have discussed in the discussion of the previous slide regarding, you know, the glorious revolution of 1688 that actually curtailed the powers of monarchy and increased the powers of the parliament. Then obviously there were other things such as, you know, the religious and political strife amongst European powers like England, France, Spain, and others for the control of the other parts of the world. Places like India, places like Egypt, places like Latin America, that were important as markets, that were important as providers of raw materials and human resources. Places like the Caribbean islands. So there was a lot of strife onward among the European powers. And there were other movements also. The conflict between the sects, the Catholics and the Protestants, we all know about that. The conflict stemming from the colonial greed of ambition of various countries. Okay, from events to movement, let's go to the next thing. Okay, we all know that romantic literature, romanticism, and the romantic movement, these were based on rejection of certain things, certain facets, certain perspectives, and the promotion of other things. What was rejected? Rules and conventions were rejected. The excessive dependence on rationality was rejected. And what was promoted? An interest in the far away and the long ago. A returning interest in nature. A deep-rooted interest in the individual and the hidden recesses of his mind or her mind. These things were there. Now, we were discussing certain things, but because of the network problem, there was a momentary hitch. So let's come back. We are discussing genres and styles, you know. Romantic literature, if you look at it, you just look at the texts that have been selected for you. Is there any verse satire? of the kind of, say, Rape of the Lock or Macflecknoe or Danciad or Absalom and Achitophel? No. There are lyrical poems, personal poems, the ballads, odes, and at the same time, there are novels, but novels of a different type. Now, who are the important writers of the Romantic period? When you talk about the writers of the Romantic period, the first names you take are those of poets. Poets like Wordsworth, Keats, Coleridge, Shelley. Obviously, the styles are also different. And this is why, people like Blake, people like Wordsworth, they actually wrote in a different way from their neoclassical predecessors. The styles were different because their emphasis was different. The individual, imagination, the emotional stress and turmoils of the individual, all these things were more important for the Romantic writers. And that's why their styles were different. Okay. Next. Now, I was talking about the writers and their works. So, these are things that I need to talk about now. We all know, arguably, the first works of the Romantic period that are nowadays read and commented upon are the works of Blake and also the very famous work of Wordsworth and Coleridge. In 1789, the year in which the French Revolution took place, William Blake came up with the Songs of Innocence. In 1794, when the sky-high hopes from the revolution were dampened and the revolution degenerated into an irrational bloodbath, Blake in 1794 added the Songs of Experience to this volume of Songs of Innocence. And the full volume became known as the Songs of Innocence and of Experience. A binary. Similarly, in 1798, Wordsworth and Coleridge published lyrical ballads. Lyrical ballads, look at this. Lyric is a personal poem that expresses the emotions and experiences of the individual or a persona. And what is ballad? Ballad is a narrative poem. But they juxtapose the two. Lyrical ballads. Then there were spiritual autobiographies, like the prelude of our Wordsworth. Supernatural poems that dealt with, again, the long ago, the far away, medieval times, the Greco-Roman classical period. These were alluded to and dwelt upon in details. For example, you think about it, a medieval author, Kubla Khan, is actually the subject of Coleridge's poem of the same name. We also talk about Christabel, the rhyme of the ancient mariner. Again, the setting is the polar circle. and also the equator. Frankenstein, you know where the setting is. Walton is going for an Arctic expedition. We all know about this. Okay. Then nature became very, very forceful as a presence. Gone were the days when we were exclusively talking about the urban setting. For example, you think about the setting of Rape of the Lock and you compare it to the setting of Tintin Abbey and you will understand the difference. So these were important changes. The shift was of emphasis. And this is something we have to understand. The next. Okay. We all know that the individual was put at the center of everything. So the self and his subjectivity, the way he perceived the world, this was to be given more importance. Okay. So you have to understand this. And you know, because the self became important, his perception or her perception of the world, his perception or her attitude to the world, these became important. Understood? Okay. Then the next point is, after self and subjectivity, yes? After self and subjectivity, the next point is, you know, the imagination of the person, the individual, that was given more importance. Why? Because after the overdose of reason, man wanted a freedom. And that's why you will see that you have on your syllabus bird poems, Ode to a Nightingale. And there are other bird poems written by the Romantics. To a skylark, to the skylark, to the cuckoo, all these things are referred to. Why? Because they are the symbols of imagination, of freedom from the constraints of this world, of this earth-bound life. Understood? So, in order to make sense of romantic literature, we have to understand what the importance of imagination is. Romantic imagination, a very, very old but important book, was written by Charles Maurice Bowra, Romantic Imagination. And even people like Cynthia Chase, people like Macan have also given more importance to imagination. But at the same time, they have qualified it with an important section on reality. Because contrary to the conventional opinion, the romantic writers were not only thinking about imaginative things. They were not only imagining things, they were observant as well. They were observing what was going on in their surroundings. They were being very, very interested in other happenings of the time. The Corn Law the Peterloo massacre, the French Revolution, all these things gave very important subjects to their poetic endeavors. And that's why Trance and Ode is a very important poem written by Coleridge. That is why other poems of this type were also written by the Romantic poets. Okay. So you see, nature and man, the relationship between nature and man was something that was also very important for the Romantic writers. You read any poem by Wordsworth, you will see that Wordsworth was a great poet of nature. But will you find any one poem by Wordsworth where nature is mentioned but man is not? No. If there is nature, there is man. And this is something you have to understand, the close relationship between nature and man. Because the Romantics were looking for liberation. They were bleeding on the thorns of life like Shelley. And then they wanted not only an escape from this reality, but an emancipation. This was a time when voices were being raised for the abolition of slavery. This was the time when the rights of man were being talked about by people like Thomas Paine, William Godwin, when the gender equality was being talked about by Hester Shepon or your Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother. And that is why, it is very, very wrong and simplistic to call Romantic literature escapist. They dealt with very important issues of human life. Often, certain critics have pointed out that this was not an escape from reality, but also an escape into a higher reality. But I would like to qualify this by talking about even the mundane reality. Yes, sometimes some poets, some writers were trying to escape from a none too happy, none too rosy reality that they were encountering. A poet like Keats, a drug addict like De Quincey, they were trying to escape to another plane of existence, of perception. But at the same time, in other poems by other writers, there was also a very, very thoroughgoing discussion of contemporary reality. This was also a time about the natural and the supernatural. So along with man and nature, there was also nature and supernature. Why is it important? When we read poems of Wordsworth and Coleridge, we all know about their understanding. Before they brought out this volume, Lyrical Ballads, they had decided what each was going to do. One wanted to defamiliarize the everyday, another wanted to secure poetic faith for the fantastic. That was Coleridge. And here, people like Shelley and Byron, with their radical political views, their bohemian lifestyle, their sympathy for the emancipation of mankind, revolutionary struggles being engaged in different parts of the continent. They were not only talking about figments of fancy. And that is why I would like you, my dear friends, to understand a very simple thing now, once for all, that it is wrong to classify romanticism, romantic literature, merely as imaginative or escapist. Okay. Next. Yes. Gender and sexuality is something that you also need to know. You know, from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage to Don Juan, Byron was creating the Byronic hero, the daring, often immoral, at any rate amoral, adventurous male figure, at once dangerous and fascinating. And much of romantic poetry and romantic literature, we must say, has got, like all other periods, a very, very important and in some ways understandable fondness for male issues and male subjects, because the readership was predominantly male, but it was changing. And that is why, slowly but surely, women writers and subjects important to women, these were also making their presence felt. We think about the works of Jane Austen. We think about the works of Mary Shelley that I am going to talk about later. If you permit me some extension of time. You see, in Frankenstein, for example, Mary Shelley is presenting a very trenchant critique of the predominantly androcentric, male-centered approach, male bohemianism, whereby creation could be made possible without the female principle, but this type of demoniacal creation would have disastrous consequences. So gender and sexuality is something that any serious understanding of romantic literature cannot preclude. Okay, next point. Yes. The romantic writers, they wanted liberation. They wanted to experiment with their individuality and with their experiences. Sometimes it led to a feeling of guilt because immorality often crept in. You take up a work such as Dissection and Ode by Coleridge, and you will see what I really want to mean. But at the same time, there is ecstasy. There is a sudden understanding, a mystical expansion of perception, whereby you tend to understand in a spot of time. This concept is mooted by Wordsworth. when you understand the real significance of the world and your place in the world, your perception of world, you think about a poem such as the Tintern Abbey, lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey, and you will see that stage by stage, your perception of nature, your perception of reality. I am not going to talk about the industrial trouble that was brewing at the back of Wordsworth's mind while writing this poem Tintern Abbey, because this is UG for undergraduate students. But when you grow up later on, please read these things also, because we need to question our conventional approach to romantic literature. Okay, so ecstasy means coming outside and understanding the real significance of the world. And that is what we see in romantic literature. You understand, you realize what this world and your action, your own action mean. You think about the deathbed realization of Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's book. How power always requires responsibility. When you apply power, when you use power, you have to be responsible. And that is what we are going to talk about in this section of our discussion. In a hurried way, let us look at what are, let us go to the next slide, please. Yes, the text, the selected texts. In a nutshell, we will talk about them because we have referred to many of them in course of our discussion till now. You know, let us take up two poems, not all poems by Blake. One, the lamb, another, the tiger. If the lamb actually talks about the perspective of the child, the innocent child, then the tiger deals with the enormity of creation. The lamb, as we all know, is a meek and docile animal. Very innocent, because the Christian symbolism of the lamb and its identification with Christ can very easily be thought about. At the same time, we have to think about the tiger. Look at the poem. I am going to concentrate on two words. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Could. The question is ability, about ability. But then, at the fag end of the poem, what is written? What immortal hand or eye dared frame thy fearful symmetry? So, here the question is of daring, of courage, of confidence, of foolhardiness even. Because by creating the tiger, the Godhead, the Creator, is unleashing on this world a power like the French Revolution, like Victor Frankenstein's monster, that will be very, very hard to control. So it is not only the thing about ability, it is also the question of responsibility. It is also the question of courage and control that we need to think about. Okay. What about Tinterneve? It is a topographical poem. It describes the landscape. A landscape, a sylvan landscape, the river Wye, and the bank, the river bank, that a young Wordsworth would bound through like a little deer. Then a young but mature Wordsworth would apprehend sensuously, and a mature, more mature, ripe sensibility of the poet of maturer years to take in the real significance, the import of the motive force, the pantheistic presence, the presence of God, the presence of the force that not only gives life but also operates this world, whose dwelling is in the setting sun and in the round ocean, everywhere. Pan means everywhere. Okay. So that is what we have to think about. A spiritual comprehension not only of the nature of the world and reality outside, but also our responsibility, the mystery of our presence in the face of that infinite. Because as in the Bright Star, Keats tells us that even though his life is going to end, the star will remain. The bright star, the pole star, that is looking down on him, will look down on the world even when he will be a sword. Okay. We know that a peculiar choice has been made, but at the same time a very, very significant choice has been made, both by the UGC and by the authorities of Kalyani University, by including poems of Robert Burns, the Scottish poet. The two poems that have been chosen for your study are very important and very significant. One is the Burns epitaph that talks about the resolute life and the doleful end of a minstrel, of a Scottish poet, you know. And then there is also Scots Guahe. We all know about Shelley and Byron and their sympathy for the revolutionary struggle in which the meek and the weak would engage in against the high and the mighty. Similarly, this poem apparently is an address by Robert Bruce to the Scottish soldiers, to such Scottish soldiers who have bled with Wallace beforehand. So liberty. Okay. Liberty is something that is very much sought after by the romantic literatures. Well, my backup team is telling me that I have already overstayed my welcome. I have spoken for 1 hour and 20 minutes. So please let me know whether I should sum up or go on for a few minutes more. Shilpi, if you can hear me, please let me know. Unmute your microphone and let me know whether I can go on. Dear students, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Do I go on or sum up? Do I discuss the points a few minutes more or sum up? Hello? Well, you see, I have got the note from your teacher, Shilpi Bosha. So whether you like it or not, I am going to continue. You know, if a teacher is a Bengali teacher, the problem is to force him to stop. When we start with teachers, we often go on and on without thinking about the poor students. Okay, I am coming to the end. Don't worry. I have talked about Keats. I have talked about Burns. I have talked about Wordsworth. Yes, I need to talk a little bit about Shelley. You know, you think about the symbolic presence and significance of the west wind. Think about it. Symbolically, the west wind is not only the destroyer, but also the preserver. It destroys what? It destroys only what is decrepit. In the words of Nazrul Islam, যা মিথ্যা কলুষিত পুরাতন পচা, the poet revolts against that only. But also at the same time preserves life, preserves vitality, preserves youth, innocence, vibrancy, and whatever is fit for preservation. So the romantic poets were not only rebels, they were also pioneers. They were also upholders of values, because as Shelley would have us believe, they were the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Okay. From the husband, let us come to the wife. Because I have already talked about Byron, I am leaving him for the time being. Oh, I have not. Yes, I have also talked about dejection and hope. So let us come to Frankenstein. Frankenstein is important. If you look at the syllabus, my dear students, is there any one of you who can tell me anything different about Mary Shelley or Frankenstein as against the other works or the other authors chosen? Is there anything new or different in Frankenstein or in Mary Shelley? Yes, what you are thinking is right. Mary Shelley is the only woman writer who has been chosen for your study. And Frankenstein really gives us a trenchant critique of the gendered understanding of the world. I am not going to talk about posthumanism, but I am going to tell you, my dear friends, when you grow up, when you become more mature, when in your postgraduate days, or even during your time of leisure, look it up. I will give certain materials to your teacher for circulation. You may not require all of them at present, but keep them handy and read them in leisure afterwards, so as to derive newer insights about texts that you have already read. Why am I saying this? Because see, when I was a child, I read Gulliver's Travels. I read it only as an adventure story, or Robinson Crusoe. But when I read it, or I read it for teaching, I actually discovered certain hidden nuances of the text. The agenda of the author. How an author, and by implication even the work, is a product of the race, the milieu, and the moment. All these things will have to be dealt with later on with proper time at our disposal. Okay, you see, look at the two very important romantic figures, Walton and Frankenstein. The artist or artificer, the scientist, and also the explorer. In the time of the ancient mariner, we have come across the ancient mariner. In Kubla Khan, we have come across the youth, the figure of the poet, at once dangerous and inspired. Here, we come across Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, who creates the monster, just as the Godhead created the tiger. And this leads to unforeseen complications and complications. Why? Because both Walton and Victor Frankenstein, even though they are not artists in the conventional sense of the term, they are at least pioneers. They are both trying in their own different ways to push back the boundaries of knowledge and experience. One in the realm of geography, in the case of Walton, another in the realm of science, in the case of Victor Frankenstein. But then, just like the French Revolution, one can create, one can unleash, one can theorize. But when reality breaks, if there is not awareness, you think about the family that the monster tried to help. The monster was very civil with the little girl, drowning little girl, or the family, the members of that family. But they were not aware of, they were not expecting such a monstrous presence. So man has to be made aware of, man has to be made educated in order to receive and utilize the power of a great change, because otherwise it will only be cataclysmic change, just like the French Revolution. In spite of its high ideals, it degenerated into a bloodbath. Similarly, you think about the noble intentions of Victor Frankenstein. But ultimately, what does he end up unleashing on this world? A creature that society makes into a monster. We are reminded of Rousseau. We are born free, but everywhere we are in chains. So how society changes us and chains us, that is something that the Romantics also did. So in course of my partial and rather rambling discussion, I have tried to make sense of certain facets of Romantic literature. Whether I have succeeded or failed is for you to understand and for you to say. But I end here my discussion. So I must thank you all for bearing with me for such a long time. So thanks for everything.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your wonderful lecture. I thank you on behalf of my students, on behalf of my department, and we will all look forward to your next lecture. Students, on the next, on 28th, you will have another lecture on 18th century literature that will be delivered by another speaker. I will detail you the date and time through WhatsApp. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.